Hi everyone, my name is Lisa Snow and welcome to A Conscious Earth. In the last video, I talked about my history as to where I have been in terms of chronic illness. And so in this episode, I actually wanted to share some of those symptoms and ailments with you. And so I wanted to break it down into two parts, and that's because initially I knew from a surface perspective these were the ailments and conditions that I was struggling with, but then when I started to get then when I started to get some support from integrative doctors and specialists, my journey started to really unfold. And so I then started to really understand what was going on from an internal perspective of my human body and what those symptoms were on the outside. And so to begin with, I'm going to start with headaches and migraines because I suffered with migraines from the time I was a child, and so I was medicated for those as well. And so that was a really hard phase in my life as a child, consistently having these migraines. But I didn't understand that from being a child. But it wasn't until very, very recently when I started down the path of integrative modalities and methodologies and getting into the science and the research that I really began to understand what those migraines were about. And so that wasn't the only thing. As a child, I had warts as well. Like my fingers, they were covered in warts as a child, and eventually the warts disappeared. But then I started to get plantar warts in my adult life. And the interesting thing was, I actually had a plantar wart for 7 or 8 years, maybe even 9. I can't remember. Could not get rid of it. Kept going back and forwards to the doctors. But it wasn't until I changed my nutrition that the plantar wart disappeared. And I'm going to come back to that, if not today, another time. Now, when I did realize that I was beginning to feel chronically unwell and I didn't really understand it, my very first trigger was that I had the permanent onset of a cold or flu. Now, I wasn't sick though. I didn't have a runny nose or a sore throat or anything like that, but I just had this permanent heaviness that sat like around this part of my face here. And I wanted to call it sinusitis, but it wasn't sinusitis because I'd never had sinusitis before. I just knew it was like a heaviness around here. For years, I just thought it was permanent hay fever. And I'm going to come back to that again briefly because I then, years down the track, realised what that actually was. In winter, I would always get chilblains on my fingers as well. I suffered from depression for most of my life, and these days, if I'm having one of those moments where I'm feeling like a little bit depressed for whatever reason, today it's very situational and I move through it really quickly today. But all those years ago, it was chronic depression. I also had 7 pregnancies as well, and so this is something that I will share more in detail with down the track, but I went through, so I've got my 2 beautiful kids, but I also had 5 miscarriages as well, and so 2 of those miscarriages resulted in surgeries because after I had miscarried, the fetuses were not releasing from my body, so I had to have 2 surgeries for those. That's trauma to the body. I also, with my 2 beautiful kids, my labour with my son was a really traumatic labour that resulted in an emergency C-section. That's a trauma to the body as well. And all of these things, they impact us later in life, and things that we just totally dismiss. My daughter, she was a planned C-section, and I'm carrying trauma from that because I now understand I could have had her naturally, but I didn't have the knowledge and information back in those days, and she could have come out naturally, but the doctors advised me to have the C-section, and that's something that emotionally I have to deal with. And I'm still working through that to this day because I now have to work with the fact that there's emotional trauma stored around the fact that I wanted natural births and I feel like I was robbed of those opportunities. So again, these are traumas to the body that also impact us from an underlying perspective that we don't think about. I had gestational diabetes with my daughter as well. Excuse me. And so that was something that I had to deal with too. And then after my daughter was born, after having gestational diabetes and then introducing so many foods back into my life again that I hadn't really eaten while I was pregnant with her, I all of a sudden had sinusitis. I'd never had sinusitis in my life before, and I now understand what that was about. And again, when I start talking about food in these video posts, food was a really big part of that, and I'll explain it more down the track. So eventually, when I did discover integrative medicine and I started working with an integrative doctor who just sent me away with so many different resources, and as I said, that was the day that I really started to understand what the human body was all about. And so what I realized is things like those cold and flu symptoms that I was talking about earlier, I later on discovered that was neurological fatigue. So that was a neurological effect that I was having all of those years ago that I did not understand. But that was also being accompanied by adrenal fatigue as well. Now, adrenals sit just above each kidney, and they're what's responsible for our fight and flight response, our adrenaline, our cortisol, all of those things. My body was being consistently flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, which are highly, highly corrosive to the human body. But not only that, it was massively impacting my nervous system, and it was actually causing me to have neurological fatigue. Brain fog as well. So when we're overly stressed, when our adrenals are overly burdened, again, like we get brain fog. And you'll hear people say, "Oh, I've got baby brain, I'm going to have that for the rest of my life." No. I am living proof that when we start putting one foot in front of the other and we start looking after our bodies in a completely different way, that brain fog can be reversed. And so I know that when I've got brain fog these days, because it can happen, I still occasionally get neurological fatigue. I know when my adrenals are fatigued, and I know when I've got brain fog. I know that something has to change within my environment for me to rejuvenate so I don't have those symptoms. Fibromyalgia started to pop up after I had kids. I was carrying kids in my arms for many, many, many years. And so again, this comes down to a nervous system issue. And so when it comes to fibromyalgia, I now know that if I'm starting to get symptoms of that, I know the steps that I need to take in terms of alleviating those symptoms. And again, I do it all through natural modalities and methodologies. Fatty liver. The liver I now understand to be the powerhouse of the body when it comes to so much of our chronic illness. And so my passion around the liver is that when we alleviate the liver from so many chemicals and toxins and viral load and pathogens, we can alleviate our symptoms also. And the last one is food intolerances too. And this is where I discovered that I had many food intolerances when I started to discover all those other things that I was just talking about. Now, this is an interesting one because for years I deprived myself of the foods that I loved so much, but I was then creating more stress for myself not being able to eat them. I've now been able to finally find that balance and be healthy at the same time and still enjoy the foods that I love as well. But that's something I'm going to talk about again more on another day. So I'm out of time now for this part of my video upload. But all of this is going to unfold in the future, and the symptoms that I talk about here for me, they're just a few. The things that I will talk about down the track might relate to you also, but we will get into this and we will unpack it, and hopefully there's something here that will resonate with you and you go, oh, maybe I will try that. Maybe that's something that could help one of my symptoms for. So I'm out of time for now, but I look forward to being back here with you soon where I can really delve into this stuff and unpack it all for you. Take care, everyone, and bye for now.